There's a moment a lot of people have, usually late at night, that goes something like this. You open your banking app, not because you need to check anything, you checked an hour ago, but you open it again, scroll through the same numbers, close it, and feel roughly the same amount of anxiety you felt before, maybe a little more. And what makes this moment interesting isn't the anxiety. It's the fact that the numbers aren't even bad. You're not in crisis. You didn't miss a payment. There's money there. Enough, arguably. And still, the feeling doesn't move. You close the app and tell yourself the same thing you always tell yourself. I just need to make more money. If I had more, I'd feel fine. Here's the thing, though. You've said that before. Maybe at a different number, a smaller one. And when you got to this number, the one that's supposed to be enough, you said it again. And you'll say it at the next one too. So if the number keeps changing and the feeling stays the same, at some point you have to ask, what are we actually dealing with here? Because it's not a math problem. Most people frame their relationship with money as a logistics issue. Income minus expenses, budget, discipline, cut the subscriptions, make more, invest. The framework is clean, rational, and almost completely useless for the people who need it most. Because the people who struggle most with money aren't struggling with information. They're struggling with something that lives underneath information, something that no spreadsheet reaches. Think about the person who earns more than they ever thought they would and still feels like they're one bad month away from disaster. Think about the person who can't stop buying things they don't need and feels genuinely terrible about it, but does it again next week. Think about the person who avoids looking at their finances entirely, not because they're careless, but because opening that tab feels like opening a door they can't close again. These aren't people who need a budgeting app. These are people in a specific kind of pain that money never created and money will never fix. What they have isn't a money problem. What they have is a relationship with safety that got broken somewhere long before any of this began. Here's what safety actually looks like in the nervous system, practically speaking. When you grew up watching adults fight about bills, really fight, the kind where dinner gets quiet and no one explains why, your brain took notes. It wasn't abstract. It was sensory. The tension in the room, the sound of a phone call that changed the mood of the whole house, the thing nobody said out loud but everyone felt. Your brain, which was young and wiring itself for survival, made a very logical conclusion. Money is danger. Or more precisely, the absence of money is a state of emergency. And here's the part that matters. That conclusion doesn't just fade because you grew up. It doesn't automatically update when your circumstances change. It runs, quietly, constantly, underneath every financial decision you make. This is why someone can earn a genuinely good salary and still panic when they see their balance dip below a certain number. A number that's completely arbitrary in objective terms, but that the nervous system treats like a line in the sand. This is why someone can know, intellectually, that they can afford something and still feel a specific kind of guilt when they buy it. Not a moral guilt, something older than that. The math says you're fine. The body doesn't believe the math. That gap between what is true and what the body is certain of is where most people live without realizing it. And the reason this stays invisible is because money is such a concrete, tangible thing. You can count it. You can point to it. It gives the feeling a shape that feels real, logical, addressable. You can build an entire identity around fixing it. You can spend years optimizing, tracking, earning more, stressing more, and feel like you're working on the problem because at least you're working on something you can name. But the feeling underneath it doesn't have a spreadsheet. It's not asking for better yield on a savings account. It's asking for something that money is actually terrible at providing, and that most people never consciously ask for because they've been told their whole lives that money is the answer. It isn't. Not to this. Let's name what it actually is, because there are a few different versions of this, and they look similar from the outside but come from different places. There's the person who grew up with instability, real, material instability. Parents who struggled, houses that changed, years that were tight. And even though that's decades behind them now, they carry a kind of vigilance that never fully turned off. They're not anxious because they're irresponsible. They're anxious because their brain spent years in a state of genuine threat, and it got very good at scanning for danger. Money became the proxy for that danger. So even when the danger is gone, the scanning continues. This person doesn't have a money problem. They have unprocessed survival experience. Then there's the person who never had material instability, but grew up in a house where money was a moral thing, where spending was selfish, where wanting things was embarrassing, where financial responsibility was tied to worth as a person. This person can afford a decent life, but can't let themselves live it without guilt. They hold back purchases they can easily make. They feel vaguely ashamed of their own desires. They give more than they should and ask for less than they need. This person doesn't have a money problem either. They have a permission problem. Specifically, they were never given permission to take up space. And money is just the place where that shows up most visibly. And then there's the person who spends, who uses money like pressure release. Who knows every time that they probably shouldn't and does it anyway? Not out of laziness, out of relief. Because there's something about buying something, even something small, even something useless, that momentarily interrupts a feeling that's been too loud for too long. That's not a budgeting problem. That's emotional regulation wearing a price tag. 3 different behaviors, 3 different origins. All of them get labeled the same way, a money problem. What makes this particularly hard to see is that money is one of the few areas where we're encouraged to suffer in silence, privately, and frame that suffering as a personal failure. You don't talk about it at dinner. You don't mention the anxiety. You don't say, I opened the app 4 times today and still felt like everything was about to collapse. You find a reason to blame yourself for not earning enough, for not saving enough, for not being the kind of person who has this figured out. And self-blame, while genuinely miserable, has a strange function. It keeps the problem in a category that feels solvable. If the problem is you, specifically your discipline or intelligence or choices, then theoretically you can fix it. The real thing, the nervous system, the childhood, the years of learning to associate money with safety or worth or love, that doesn't have a to-do list attached to it. So you stick with the comfortable diagnosis. Not enough money. Need more money. Problem is money, and you keep opening the app at night wondering why nothing changes. There's something worth sitting with here, and it's uncomfortable, which is probably why it doesn't get said enough. The amount of money you have, past a certain threshold, is not what determines how you feel about money. What determines how you feel about money is the story you were handed, or that you built about what money means, about what it makes you, about what it would mean to lose it, about whether you're the kind of person who gets to have it. And those stories are incredibly durable. They don't care about your income. They don't care about your net worth. They just run, quietly under everything, making their own decisions. This is why people who suddenly come into significant money through a raise, a windfall, an inheritance, frequently report feeling exactly the same within a few months. Not because they mismanaged it, though sometimes that happens, but because the story is still the same story. The container changed. The water didn't. You can see this in the specific vocabulary people use when they talk about money, even in casual conversation. I don't deserve that. I'm terrible with money. Money just doesn't stick to me. I'll never be the kind of person who has savings. These aren't just figures of speech. They're identity statements. They're declarations about who a person believes they are, and identity has a way of organizing reality to confirm itself. The person who is certain they're bad with money will find evidence everywhere. The person who believes wealth is for other kinds of people will keep a comfortable distance from it, often without noticing they're doing it. Not out of stupidity, out of loyalty, to a version of themselves that was built under very specific conditions, and that never got updated. So what do you actually do with this? Not in a 10-step framework way, in a real way. The first thing is probably the hardest, and it's just to notice the moment. The specific moment when the financial decision is happening, the avoiding, the compulsive checking, the guilty purchase, the inexplicable panic, and to pause there long enough to ask a different question. Not, what should I do with money, but what am I afraid of right now? And more specifically, Is this fear actually about right now, or is it about something older that just borrowed this moment? That question doesn't fix anything immediately, but it starts to separate the signal from the noise. It starts to make visible the thing that's been running quietly in the background for years, which is the first step to not being entirely governed by it. The second thing is harder to name, but it goes something like this. The goal isn't to stop feeling things about money. The goal is to understand what the feeling is actually asking for. Because the anxiety about the bank balance at midnight isn't really about the bank balance. It's about wanting to feel safe. The compulsive spending isn't really about the thing being bought. It's about wanting, briefly, to not feel the weight of something unresolved. The inability to spend on yourself isn't really about money. It's about whether you believe you're worth taking care of. Those are real needs. They're just being funneled through the wrong channel. Money cannot make you feel safe if you learn to feel unsafe before money ever entered the picture. It can provide security, real material security that matters, but the feeling of being safe, of being okay, at a level that's bone deep, that's not in anyone's account balance. It never was. There's a version of financial health that almost nobody talks about, which is the version that has nothing to do with income or savings rates and everything to do with your ability to be present in a financial moment without being hijacked by something that happened 20 years ago. It looks like making a decision about money. Any decision, small or large, and feeling like you're actually the one making it. Not like you're being dragged by a current you can't see. Not like the anxiety is deciding for you. Not like you owe some past version of yourself a punishment or a protection that isn't relevant to your current life. It looks like spending on something without the guilt arriving before you've even closed the tab. It looks like seeing your balance drop temporarily and not interpreting that as the beginning of a catastrophe. It looks like saving without hoarding and spending without numbing and wanting without shame. That's not a financial achievement. It's an emotional one, and you don't get there by making more money. You get there by tracing the fear back to where it actually started and slowly, patiently, updating a story that was written in circumstances that no longer apply. The next time you find yourself convinced that the problem is the number, that a slightly different number would finally make everything feel okay, try holding that thought for just a second, not to dismiss it. The number matters. Real money represents real options and real freedom, and that's not nothing. But ask yourself honestly, what would the number have to be before you stop checking the app at midnight? What would it have to be before the fear quieted? Before you actually felt like you were going to be all right? If the answer keeps moving, if it's always just a little more than wherever you are, then the number was never the point. The thing you're looking for was never in the account. It's somewhere older than that. And unlike a savings balance, it actually can be found. It just requires looking in the right place.